Plymouth Rock. This is where it all began, well, at least for the settlers when they first set foot here to found the colony. But the real story began 3,500 miles in that direction with Robert Browne at Lilford Hall. If you ask the average American to name just one person who could be regarded as providing the real seed of inspiration behind the formation of the nation, there would be many different opinions. People would suggest the likes of George Washington, the Pilgrim Fathers, and Benjamin Franklin. Although these iconic people are significant players in building America into a country in its own right, none of them could ever be really regarded as being the father of the nation. Even Christopher Columbus didn't do anything very special, because he simply rediscovered a continent which had been known about and occupied by Western Europeans for around 30,000 years. A surprising new discovery made in England by Charles Micklewright is now set to change American public opinion and the history books. It seems that there was one extraordinary man who provided the real seed of inspiration behind the formation of the entire nation of the United States. The first person to separate church from state. The man who was the inspiration behind the Pilgrim settlers at Plymouth Colony, and yet surprisingly never set foot on American soil himself. Robert Browne of the Lilford Estate in Northamptonshire, England.
Robert Browne inspired a nation and democracy. As far as I'm concerned, it was more than religion. It was about freedom for the people, the new world.
Robert Browne is fundamentally important to the American history. The reason is that he was the person that inspired these people to get onto the Mayflower and start this new colony, and that colony formed America.
The Lilford Estate is recognised in England as being a place of national importance, as a Grade 1 listed building. But when Charles Micklewright became Lord of the Manor and began his one-man quest to restore the building to its former glory, some surprise discoveries were made. It soon became clear that the Lilford Estate wasn't just of great importance in English history, but it was of equal or perhaps even greater importance in American history.
No, well, John Carver was one of the followers, one of the Brownists.
The Quincy's actually were his neighbour. They literally lived next door. He inspired them, and in 1627 they took off, and in a few generations they produced an American president. I mean, imagine that, John Quincy Adams.
It's absolutely astonishing, just this tiny little village. George Washington's family lived in Islip, which is about 4 miles away.
It was a direct descendant of Robert Browne that fired the first shot in the American War of Independence. The extraordinary connection between the Lilford Estate in England and the United States has literally spanned the centuries. And in World War II, it was converted into a field hospital for US servicemen.
This is the last remaining structure of the World War II American Air Force Hospital, which was situated in this part of the park. There were around about 100 mission huts where the patients were kept. You can see the hall in the background. The house was occupied by 40 nurses. All the men were occupied in the mission huts.
Prior to the founding of Plymouth Colony, there had only been military bases constructed to secure various sections of resource-rich territory for the major European nations of the time. The founding of Plymouth Colony was very different. This was a pivotal moment in world history. Little did they know it at the time, but the Pilgrim Fathers, or the Brownist immigration as they were actually called, were destined to become the core of the modern American people as a nation. Today, we've almost no frame of reference whatsoever in what a monumental undertaking it was for them to cross the Atlantic.
We separated ourselves from the church, and when we had separated and the authorities learned of it, that made us criminal. And we were We were starting to be persecuted in England, and we felt rather than stay in England and run the risk of being clapped up in prison or worse, put to death, we would take our whole congregation and put ourselves in exile in the Netherlands, where they were much more tolerant of all manner of worship.
This was a hornet's nest, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely a hornet's nest for radicalism, and definitely he stirred up all the local villages. Of course, in those days, the world was so much bigger than it is now. I mean, imagine to stir them up enough to get on a boat and go to America. I mean, it was like going to the moon.
Oh, it was awful. It was 66 days without a single beam of light. All these gun ports were closed, those hatches covered with several layers of oiled canvas.
Mayflower was very crowded, and we were in the dark and the cold and the wet for over 2 months. And many of the passengers become very ill from coughs and rheums and fevers and colds, and there was scurvy, so that about half of our passengers did die the first winter we were here.
And then there was days I think we did wonder, would the Lord see us through?
Robert Browne was just 8 years old in 1558 when Queen Elizabeth I took the throne of England. This was a period of widespread religious unrest, because after ascending to the throne, Elizabeth had quickly established the English Protestant Church, with herself as the supreme governor. Ironically, it was Robert Browne's ancestor, William Browne, who had partly bankrolled the War of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York. In the defeat of Richard III, the final victory went to the Lancastrian house of Henry Tudor, father to Henry VIII, and himself father to Queen Elizabeth I.
Queen Elizabeth had her famous proclamation, sort of effectively banning his books and banning his teachings. In fact, there's a famous quote that Queen Elizabeth is meant to have said is, "Who will rid me of troubled Church Browne?" and his followers, as you just mentioned, were actually being hanged from trees for distribution of his leaflets, which is absolutely astonishing. There were about 20,000 Brownists. I mean, Sir Walter Raleigh, who's got great connections with the state of Virginia and the States, he even said in the Houses of Parliament here that they were a vile bunch and that there were at least 20,000 of them, and that action should be taken against them.
Robert Browne was born in 1550 at Tolthorpe in Rutland, England, to a wealthy merchant family with extremely powerful and influential relatives. He enjoyed a very happy and privileged childhood, spending much of his time at the Lilford estate with his rich cousins, the Elms family, who were enormously wealthy. This was all thanks to wool, which was the international currency of the time, just as oil is today. The family basically held a virtual monopoly of the entire wool trade in England and Europe, which was effectively the world at the time.
Robert Browne was born into an aristocratic family, well schooled, firstly at Arundel School and then at Cambridge University. So he was a very cultured and a very educated man.
Robert Browne was a hugely charismatic character, very witty, very articulate, and regarded in his lifetime as a great thinker.
Even while Robert Browne was enjoying an idyllic childhood and a solid education, fate was setting him on a direct collision course with Queen Elizabeth I in the years to come. When Robert Browne was just 9 years old, the Queen passed 2 radical new laws. The first was the Second Act of Supremacy, and the second, the Act of Uniformity of Common Prayer, the administration of the sacrament. These laws effectively meant that even people of great power and importance, including the likes of President Quincy Adams's family, who also lived on part of the Lilford estate, would all be forced to attend church each week, and that reformist Protestants would be forced to attend state-controlled Anglican churches.
He found out that he started the Brownist movement because he was the first person to leave the Church of England on the basis that he felt the church should be separated from the state, which is obviously a very important American concept. And furthermore, he also came up with the first person to actually act on the idea of congregationalism, which is the idea of the people in the body of the church, the people who are praying, actually deciding about the functions of the church and who should be their priest. So he suddenly became this young, dynamic, wealthy chap with all the opportunities in front of him into this sort of spiritual person with a mission.
When he was at Cambridge itself, he was actually preaching what he believed, almost on the streets, like a street preacher. You know, he wasn't just going to university there, you know, he was stirring it up.
And so why should we be bondage to the Anglican Church? No, we should not. Because we are given a divine power from God. We are to go forth and preach His word. God's word is law, and we have been given that right to do so.
He lived for the majority of his life here on the Lilford estate. The estate was owned by his rich cousins, the Elms, and Robert Browne came to Lilford many times during his life, and then permanently from 1591 until his death in 1633.
Lilford Hall, as we see it today, was built in 1635 and was actually built around a Tudor mansion dating back to around 1480. Today, the remains of the Tudor structure are built into the core infrastructure of the hall itself, with the exception of 2 Tudor fireplaces, which were still in use until the middle and late 20th century.
The Lilford estate was a haven to Robert Browne all his life. He was chased from one place to another, he didn't settle, he was in and out of jail. From here, he was working underground and actually sending people to the New World. This was a safe haven. This was the heart of his family. He'd been here as a child, and whenever he was on the run or needed to escape, this was the place he came where, you know, he knew he was safe here. Robert Browne didn't just inspire the Mayflower passengers, he inspired modern democracy. You've got to think that Robert Browne, his perhaps philosophy came into everything these people were doing. It wasn't just about religion, it was about a new way of thinking. It was about freedom, democracy, and taking a risk.
If one considers the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth as almost the birth of the nation, as the start of the nation, then I think we're using that analogy. I think the analogy of the conception of the American nation is 1581, which is the date that Browne decided to set up his own church movement. And I would say that the Declaration of Independence is almost sort of the adulthood of becoming an adult, almost, of the American nation.
It's clear that Robert Browne had a definite influence on the people who boarded the Mayflower and crossed the Atlantic. And since that's the case, he also had a definite influence on the Pilgrim Fathers who founded the colony at Plymouth Rock. And, without knowing at the time, in doing so, founded the country that was to become the United States of America. In part 2, Conception, we see how Robert Browne became radicalised in his beliefs while attending Corpus Christi in Cambridge, how the Brownist movement was conceived, and how Robert Browne squared up in direct opposition not only to Queen Elizabeth I, but also to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the English state. We also see how a man from one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the country would begin literally risking his life for his beliefs, and with many of the Brownist followers being hunted down and hanged.